Like probably a lot of people, I've been watching the new Star Trek show, Strange New Worlds, and one thing that I noticed is how effectively the first episode of the show uses the hero's journey story structure. Now, that's not particularly unusual. A lot of stories use the hero's journey, including many Star Trek episodes, but I did think that it did a pretty good job with it and was really interesting how it played out, so I want to talk about it. Stories that follow the hero's journey typically begin in the ordinary world. The ordinary world being not necessarily present day real world Earth, but just some place that's very typical and dull and nothing really unexpected tends to happen there. That is where the main character is from. Now, Strange New Worlds does something really interesting with this because it starts on a planet that at first glance seems to be Earth. There's these humanoids and you don't see their faces clearly, and they're talking about first contact. But then that turns out to be an alien planet. When you get to see the characters' faces more clearly, they are clearly alien. They have, ridges and spots on their foreheads, as aliens in Star Trek tend to do. And the aliens that they are actually making first contact with are Starfleet officers. But then after giving that twist on the idea of the ordinary world and the expectation that it starts someplace ordinary, then we go to Montana, where Captain Pike is living. And that's much more what we would typically expect to see with the ordinary world. Usually, the hero of the hero's journey will receive a call to adventure, which they'll initially try to refuse. And that happens almost immediately after Captain Pike is introduced. His phone is ringing, and the other Starfleet captain who he's with points it out, but he doesn't answer. And then later, a shuttlecraft lands right in his path as he's riding on his horse. And the guy who gets off of the shuttle is like, "You didn't answer your phone. We need you." So, you can try to refuse the call, but usually if you are the hero in the hero's journey, you can't refuse it for too long. It's going to come and find you. Captain Pike finds out that his first officer, Una, has gone missing on an away mission that involved first contact. Of course, that is, first contact with the aliens that were introduced in the first scene. And while he still tries to push back and refuse the call again, the admiral who he's talking to just really doesn't make it an option. He gives him an order to take on this mission and then quit when he gets back if he wants to. Another thing that I think is very interesting is that there was actually a second ordinary world and call to adventure scenario right after Captain Pike's. Even though he is very much the hero of the hero's journey, in this episode at least, Spock is also introduced through a very similar set of circumstances. He's on Vulcan getting engaged to T'Pring, which if you've seen the original series episode Amok Time, that doesn't turn out too well. But in any case, he gets a call from Captain Pike, and he doesn't hesitate to accept the call to adventure at all. He immediately is like, "I'll be there right away, T'Pring will understand." Vulcan is certainly not the ordinary world from a human perspective, but from Spock's perspective, it's his home planet. It's the ordinary world to him. So, like I said, it doesn't have to be present-day Earth or even the closest equivalent. It's just whatever is normal for the main characters, the world that they're leaving behind to go on their journey. After that, we get our crossing the first threshold moment when they board the Enterprise. Even though the Enterprise is very familiar to anyone who's familiar with Star Trek, it's not the ordinary world that these characters come from. And getting on board the Enterprise means you're signing up for an adventure. At this point, the tests, enemies, and allies stage of the hero's journey begins. Now we're no longer in the ordinary world. We're in the special world. We start to meet new characters that will be allies or potentially enemies to the main character. We start to figure out more about the situation that they're in and what they're going to need to do. So the whole section where Pike is meeting the bridge crew, some new characters are introduced. They're arriving at the planet and finding out the horrible truth that this planet did not actually invent a warp drive, but a warp bomb. The part where they are getting the makeovers to look like the aliens so that they can infiltrate the planet and try and find their people. All the way up until they've rescued Una and the others, and they're in the elevator, and Pike says, "Beam out everybody except for myself and Spock." I would pinpoint that as the point where we start the approach the inmost cave scenario. At this point, the nature of the mission has changed. It's not just a rescue mission anymore. Now, Pike understands that it was their interference that led to these people developing a warp bomb in the first place, and he feels like he says, "Screw General Order 1, and that he is going to make sure that they use it responsibly and that they don't destroy their planet with it, because they should never have had this technology in the first place, and it's the Federation's fault, and more specifically his fault and the crew of Discovery." When Pike confronts the alien leader and tries first through diplomacy and then through intimidation to get her to listen and to negotiate with the opposite side, I would describe that as the ordeal. Even though it's definitely not the end of the story and there's still more to come, this is the point where it's the point of no return. He gets somewhat of a victory, and that the alien leader does have to listen to him and negotiate with the seditious faction, as she calls them. However, it's definitely not over yet, and it's only after a conversation between Captain Pike and his temporary first officer, La'an Noonien Singh, that he figures out what he has to do in order to get these people to see reason. This is what I would describe as the return with elixir moment. Now, he's not just facing the enemy and getting sort of a superficial victory. He's really overcoming the struggles that he's gone through in the entire episode, using his knowledge of his own future that's been haunting him through the whole episode, and of Earth's past, which is done in a way that makes it very relevant to modern concerns. And he uses all of that to basically show the people on this planet what their future might look like if they're not careful with how they use this technology they've developed. He talks about his experience seeing his own future, his own death, and he uses that knowledge to basically save this planet by convincing its people not to use warp technology as a weapon of mass destruction. By the end of the episode, Pike has, at least to some degree, come to terms with what he saw. He's willing to move forward. He's willing to accept the call to adventure from the beginning to become a captain again, and just to make the most of the time that he has left. Whereas at the beginning, the visions that he saw where he experienced his own death were just really holding him back and making him constantly refuse the call. I think the fact that the return with elixir moment happened on the alien planet and not on the Enterprise or on Earth is also very relevant to the fact that that was the first ordinary world that was introduced. Way back at the beginning, when it seemed like it might be Earth, maybe in the 21st century, going back to our first contact with the Vulcans. It's starting there and then the return with elixir moment happening there. I think that kind of makes sense, even though that planet is not by any means the ordinary world from a human perspective, or for any of the main characters on the show. One thing that makes something like a Star Trek episode a little bit different from something like a movie, a novel, or a myth that stands basically on its own is that there are, just by definition, going to be sequels. And so you can't really tie it all up with a pretty bow unless it's the last episode of the series. There has to be either a cliffhanger or just the feeling that they're not heading back to the ordinary world yet and the adventure will continue. So there really is no road back situation. That's the one piece of the hero's journey that's almost always missing in Star Trek. The only exceptions would be, maybe if returning to the spaceship was a big part of the episode's hero's journey, or something like Voyager, where the entire show basically is the road back part of the hero's journey. That actually might be a good topic for another video. I definitely think, and I'm not going to get into it too much here because it's not really the point, but the first episode of Voyager totally is the first half of the hero's journey, from the call to adventure all the way up to the ordeal, and then the rest of the show is the road back. That is my opinion and I am sticking to it. Anyway, I was just very interested to see how Strange New Worlds used the hero's journey in its first episode, and I think it was done pretty effectively.